Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hello, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where for as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormon Land. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. In 2014, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints published an official essay detailing Joseph Smith's marriages to multiple women. After decades of insisting otherwise, the Community of Christ, formerly the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has since conceded that the faith founder did participate in polygamy. Highly regarded scholarly works have documented Smith had at least 33 wives, and most historians widely accept that the church leader preached, albeit privately, and practiced plural marriage. So why is this issue gaining increased attention in various Mormon circles and arguing that Smith had but one wife, Emma, while pinning the practice instead on perhaps the Western world's most famous polygamist, Brigham Young, and his associates? What does the evidence really show? Why is this debate springing up now? And what do the competing factions stand to win or lose on this issue? Helping us answer those questions and more are Brooke Lefevre, a doctoral candidate at Baylor University who has written about the experiences of 19th century Latter-day Saint women in plural marriage, and Matthew Bowman, chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, who penned a recent Salt Lake Tribune column about this topic. Brooke, Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Well, Brooke, let's start with you. What is the evidence that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is kind of a variety of types of evidence that we have, right? Historians, when we analyze primary sources, we like to analyze different criteria to look at the validity of historical documents. And one of the ways that we analyze that is how contemporary the document is to the event that happened. Any document that's recorded very close to the actual event is typically given more credibility than sources that are recorded decades after the event. So as far as contemporary sources, we do have several contemporary sources that give evidence to Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. One of the most important ones is the William Clayton diary that details not only William Clayton's experience with polygamy, but also Joseph Smith's experiences with polygamy and Joseph Smith's teaching William Clayton about polygamy. The bulk of our sources do come later. Starting in about 1869, Joseph F. Smith and other leaders in the Mormon Church start compiling affidavits and other documents to try to prove that Joseph Smith did practice polygamy. So we have these official documents, these affidavits and other things, but we also have private writings, we have letters, we have public speeches from people who practice polygamy. We have public speeches from the wives of Joseph Smith. We have their private and public writings. So we have the bulk of our sources do come from the later years. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brooke hit the really key sources here, which are in large measure these affidavits. And there are, I just want to emphasize that there are dozens of these from many different women whom Joseph Smith married, but also from some men, like Clayton himself, who provided a long affidavit describing his conversations with Smith about polygamy, other men whom Joseph Smith introduced the practice to, fathers, brothers-in-law of women Joseph Smith married, who described how he talked to them about marriage to these women. So these affidavits are really extensive and come in a variety of different contexts. As Brooke says, some of them were gathered by leaders of the LDS Church themselves. Others were given in court cases under oath. Then those provide some, I think, additional layers of credibility. If we look to Nauvoo itself, though, contemporary sources, those are really key. One of the key things that polygamy deniers, those who say Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, will point to is the relative paucity of those sorts of sources. And there is some truth to that. We have the Clayton diary, However, we primarily, during the key years, 1843 and 1844, when Clayton is talking a lot about polygamy, we have primarily transcripts of those diary entries, although the LDS Church History Department is working on releasing a critical edition of that diary. But we also have a few other sources as well. Of course, one of the most famous is a revelation given in July of 1843 that Clayton describes transcribing in the diary. He says that he wrote it down, and that revelation is now known as Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We don't have Clayton's original transcript, but we have a copy that was made a few days after that revelation was given by a man named Joseph Kingsbury. And to what Brooks says, right, about trying to get sources as close to the original time as possible, we have what is called provenance for that copy, which is to say we know where it came from, we know who made it, we know who owned it. It was done by a man named Joseph Kingsbury. There's also a collection of documents that sometimes historians will call the Whitney collection. This is the family of Newell Whitney, whose daughters Joseph Smith married as plural wives. We have a letter in Joseph Smith's own handwriting, written in August 1842, in which Joseph Smith describes his relationship with Sarah Ann Whitney. Now, he does not use that key phrase marriage or polygamy, right? He doesn't say that, but he does describe what has passed between us recently and how this generated strong feelings in him. And we know from other sources that he married Sarah Ann Whitney just a few days earlier. We also have a revelation given in July 1842 in which Joseph Smith dictates to Newell Whitney instructions on how to perform a plural marriage. Now, again, there is a provenance issue with that revelation. The original is missing. We have a typescript that Newell Whitney's grandson, Orson Whitney, made in 1912 of the original. There is, though, a kind of a provenance there as well, though. We have sources describing the existence of this revelation back to 1842. So I think, although, as in so many historical circumstances, the evidence is a little bit spotty here and there, overall, I think the preponderance of evidence does indicate that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy.
Let me ask you the flip side of that straight up. What is the evidence that he did not?
Well, there are two buckets, just as there are kind of two buckets of evidence that he did. One is that there was a number of instances while he was presumably practicing plural marriage in Nauvoo in the 1840s of him denying that he was doing that. He gives a famous speech in May of 1844 in which he states that he is not practicing plural marriage. Under his editorship, the Times and Seasons, which is the newspaper in Nauvoo, publishes a series of statements denying that polygamy is a doctrine of the church. So that's now that's not necessarily evidence that he didn't practice it, right?
Some could argue just the opposite, that he felt compelled to deny it. Yes.
Right. But if you are inclined to the belief that he did not, though, that might be strong evidence. Right. So there's a lot of kind of holes, right? Holes in the documentation of plural marriage. I mean, that's the other really, category of evidence that he did not, which is the absence of evidence that he did. Right, which is, oh yeah, go ahead, Brooke, jump in.
I was just going to add, I think maybe you were getting to this, but the other kind of main thing, the main evidence, if you will, that he didn't practice polygamy is that his wife, Emma Smith, denied that he practiced polygamy for the rest of his life. And so that is the other, like, if you want to believe Joseph Smith's public speeches and if you want to believe Emma, then they both claim that he never practiced polygamy.
Now, Brooke, I was going to ask you about this a little later, but let me just ask right now. It comes to Emma. Did she always state that he never practiced, or did she sometimes in her life state otherwise or concede otherwise? I mean, everyone agrees that Joseph Smith was married to Emma. Okay.
Yes.
So where was Emma on all this?
Yeah, so this is where it does get tricky. In any kind of official documents that we have from Emma, any times that her words were recorded, and she says that they never practiced polygamy, that Joseph never practiced polygamy. there's ways to, so like, for example, in the William Clayton diary, he refers to Emma knowing about Joseph practicing polygamy. And we have other sources where people claim that Emma did know that they were practicing polygamy. But if you take her words, she always denied that they practiced polygamy.
Interesting. Oh, okay, so this is a question made for both of you, but I'm assuming this is not necessarily an unusual occurrence for historians to discover conflicting evidence. So what do you think when you come across conflicting evidence, and is there any way to determine the, quote, truth? Matt?
No, that's a really good question, right? And it is to say, I think a lot of people who are not trained historians or who have not tried to suss out what actually happened in situations like this may be under the impression that it's a lot easier than it actually is to determine things like this. It would be very, very easy, right, if we had say that we had a signed document from Joseph Smith dated June 1844 where he says, I married the following woman on these dates, signed Joseph Smith, right? That seems like it might be definitive. But in fact, there would be a lot of questions historians would have about such a document, which is to say the question of provenance. Where did this document come from? Is it in Joseph Smith's handwriting? How reliable is it? We cannot simply take, as Brooke has indicated with this discussion of Emma, we also cannot always take historical actors at their word because people lie. People's memories change over time. That's very well documented as well. So sources are always tricky. What historians do then is try to get as close as we can, as Brooke says, to the past. Generally speaking, that means contemporary documents are more useful, but not always, because, of course, this question of provenance. Where do the documents come from? How do we know about where they were made and when they were written and for what purpose? And oftentimes, especially, I think, with intimate relationships like those we are talking about, people just don't leave records for stuff like this, right? In the column that I wrote, I referred to the problem of Anne Rutledge. Right, who is a woman who is presumably Abraham Lincoln's first love, but there's no contemporary evidence indicating that. Rather, there are recollections of people who knew Lincoln and who knew Rutledge, describing what may have happened far in the past. Lincoln himself produced nothing describing that relationship, which means, right, that you can find very prominent historians of Abraham Lincoln, like David Herbert Donald, who is maybe the premier Lincoln biographer, who argues that Anne Rutledge, her relationship with Lincoln, is largely a myth that people have fantasized about later. And you will find other historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin who will say, no, they actually were in a relationship, right? What is the truth, right? Well, we can very rarely nail it down 100%. Just as in a trial with attorneys, right? Sometimes the best we can do is to say the preponderance of evidence points to this.
Brooke, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I agree with everything that Matt said. I think one of the problems is that people don't understand the difference between the past and history. That the past is like what actually happened. History is what we can argue happened based on the evidence. And that history is inherently, it's a discipline in which we argue with each other and we try to reinterpret things and we analyze evidence, and we're constantly kind of making new arguments and reinterpreting the past as we try to figure out what happened. So there's nothing that's sure in history, and every time we get new evidence, we will reanalyze and reevaluate the narratives that we've been telling. So yeah.
So, Brooke and Matt. Well, Brooke, what do the women who purportedly married Joseph have to say about all this?
Yeah. So we have, again, one of the most important bodies of evidence that Joseph Smith did practice polygamy were the women who later claimed that they had been married as plural wives to Joseph Smith. So we have lots and lots of documents. We have the official affidavits, we have their public speeches, their public writings, their private writings, Relief Society minute books, right, in which women are talking about their relationship to Joseph Smith. And it is clear, kind of to give credibility to the arguments of the people who are critiquing their sources. It is clear that these sources are not perfect, right? These are sources that are recorded 30, 40 years after they had been supposedly married or sealed to Joseph Smith. We can show problems with those sources. We can show problems with the affidavits. And that doesn't mean, as historians, when that happens, that doesn't mean you discount all of those sources. It means you analyze why there are those problems. It's not surprising at all that sources recorded 30, 40 years after an event would not remember that event correctly, or would have parts of that are incorrect, right? So I think one of the more interesting questions to ask is, how are those sources shaped by the changing nature of polygamy? We know that polygamy in Nauvoo was understood differently than it was by 1870 and 1880. That's something that we as historians can track. That's something that we understand change over time, right? We know that the understandings of polygamy shift. So it's interesting to look at these later sources and say, okay, what are they misremembering, or what are they interpreting in light of these changes, in light of how polygamy is now understood in the 1870s and 1880s? That's something that as historians we do. We analyze those sources in that way. But you still use those sources. You still analyze those sources. You still work with those sources.
Yeah, I was just going to give an example of what Brooke is talking about here. And it's a rather famous example in Mormon history. In her biography of her son, Lucy Mack Smith writes about dreams that her husband, Joseph Sr., had. And those dreams that she describes Joseph Sr. having, before Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, before the church was founded, map very closely onto Lehi's dreams in the Book of Mormon itself. So there's an interesting conundrum here, right? Did Joseph Smith Sr. actually have dreams that look very much like the Book of Mormon? Or did Lucy Mack Smith remember and interpret those dreams 30 years later to mirror onto what the Book of Mormon described? Now, if we were conspiracy theorists, and conspiracy theorists tend to think that everything happens for a reason, that there are no mistakes, that human memory is perfect, we might say Lucy Mack Smith is making this up. She wants to present her husband as having a vision of the Book of Mormon before it actually happened. But historians are usually, I think, more empathetic to their historical subjects than that. And we would say, right, what is actually happening here is Lucy Mack Smith is influenced by the Book of Mormon as she is remembering what happened to her husband. Very similar to what Brooke is describing with the memories of plural marriage that emerged in the 1870s and later.
Yeah, and if I can also just add briefly, so then what we do when we have all of these sources that we know are imperfect, right? They're recorded 30, 40 years later. What you do is you try to figure out like what parts of these are influenced by this faulty memory, what parts are influenced by the changes that have happened since, and what parts seem valid. And the reality is that these women all continue to claim for the rest of their lives that they had been Joseph's plural wives. And we can corroborate that with other evidence, right? We can look at how these stories, how they corroborate each other. So that's ultimately what they claim, is they say, yes, we were Joseph Smith's plural wives, and they continue to claim that for the rest of their lives.
So what are the problems with how these deniers are analyzing this historical evidence? One of
the big problems is that in general, they do just dismiss any non-contemporary sources. And like we talked about, the contemporary sources, there is evidence either way. You can make a historical case either way. They're not definitive, these contemporary sources. But typically the polygamy deniers will say, anything after 1844, we just ignore it. Or they will say, we can't trust these sources from these women. This is a direct quote from one of them. They were women who were under the power of Brigham Young and the Utah Church. This is what Michelle Stone says. She says a lot of these women had to do what they were told. So she dismisses, and a lot of these polygamy deniers dismiss the sources from the women who claim to be Joseph Smith's plural wives, claiming that they were just fabricating these stories, that they were lying because Brigham Young forced them to do so. And the problem with that is, of course, they don't actually have evidence that Brigham Young had that type of power. Did Brigham Young have a lot of power in the Utah church? Absolutely. But there were also women who did speak against him. There were women who denounced polygamy. There were women who left the church. There were women who left Utah. There's not enough evidence to support this idea that Brigham Young had so much authority that he could force all of these women to lie for their entire lives. So that's typically the reasoning that they use to dismiss these women. And the problem with it, for me, I am trained as a feminist historian, right? I'm trained in feminist theory. So I spend a lot of my time analyzing women's historical agency. And it's completely valid to interrogate the levels of agency that women had within certain patriarchal structures. Women's historical agency is almost always constrained by certain patriarchal structures. And women can face severe repercussions for resisting or violating those constraints of patriarchy. And those are things that I study, that I'm very interested in. And looking at, like, how do women work within patriarchal structures, and how do they, what benefits do they get from supporting patriarchy? So those are questions that I really care about as a historian. However, there's just not enough evidence to support this idea that women like Eliza R. Snow and Zina D. Young, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, Sarah Ann Whitney, Helen Mar Kimball, that they were all being forced to say these things, to say that they had been married to Joseph Smith, that they were Joseph Smith's plural wives. I'm sure Brigham Young wished he had that kind of power in Utah, but there's not evidence to support the fact that he did.
And Brooke, if you put it in today's vernacular, that would sort of be silencing women, wouldn't it? I mean, in a sense, in that you're throwing out what they said.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You might have your reasons for it, but...
Right. And again, I think it's very valid as a historian to look at in what ways were they manipulating the truth. Were they manipulating the truth? I think they probably were. I think there were probably instances in which they were misremembering. And I think that that's totally valid to do. I'm not trying to valorize these women and say that they were just perfect and they never lied about anything in regards to polygamy. I think they had reasons to tell the story of polygamy in a certain way. But when you completely just throw out their voices, when you completely just disregard them, what you're doing is you're doing the same thing that 19th century anti-polygamists did. In the 19th century, anti-polygamists, the way they depicted Mormon women is that they were these deluded, downtrodden slaves of domineering patriarchs. And Mormon women in the 19th century worked very hard to counter that narrative. They published the Woman's Exponent, which was owned by women, operated by women. They were very involved in politics. They were very public speakers. And so to dismiss their voices and say that they were simply just the pawns of Mormon patriarchy, and that's why they were saying what they were saying, is to do the exact same thing that 19th century anti-polygamists did.
So Matt and Brooke, why is this simmering debate now starting to boil?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to say about it is that, of course, it's a debate that's been going on for 200 years now. Right. There has never been, I think, a time, even during Joseph Smith's own lifetime, as we have seen, in which there were not arguments about whether or not he was a polygamist. This is one of the arguments that fragmented the church after his death. It is an argument that persisted throughout court cases in the 19th century United States as various churches descended from Joseph Smith sued each other, and polygamy became a really valuable tool for them to argue about who were legitimately the heirs of Joseph Smith or not. And it was an argument in the 20th century. Modern polygamy denial, I think, emerges from the mid-20th century, what was then called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Which had, because Emma Smith, who was associated with that church, denied, as Brooke said, for her entire life after Joseph Smith's death that he was a polygamist, this became a very, very closely held and dearly held tenet of the RLDS Church, that Brigham Young had corrupted the faith of Joseph Smith by adding polygamy to it. And you had then, with the opening of archives and the emergence of professional historians in the mid-20th century, a lot of this work in the RLDS Church was turned towards proving that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. And the arguments that emerge out of the mid-20th century RLDS Church have, I think, regained in the past decade or two new life on the internet. They are being seized by many people, both within and without the LDS Church, who want to prove that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. And as to why LDS people, or people who have, I think, left the LDS Church, and I'm thinking here particularly of folks like Phil Davis, the leader of the Doctrine of Christ movement, and Denver Snuffer, leader of the Remnant movement, right? These people have seized on these arguments because one of their premises is that they, Denver Snuffer, Phil Davis, have greater spiritual insight into what Joseph Smith was trying to do than the current LDS Church leadership does. And what they are trying to do then in part is create a Joseph Smith that appeals to them. Now, this is, of course, not new. This is something everybody who looks to Joseph Smith as a model does, right? People pick and choose different aspects of his life and teachings and kind of formulate a Joseph Smith that resembles them. But for Davis and for Snuffer, on the one hand, polygamy is repugnant to them because they are modern Westerners who have been raised in a society in which polygamy is seen as backward, as strange, as distasteful. But on the other hand, both of them are dissenters from the LDS Church. They have absorbed very common post-60s critiques of the LDS Church as being too hierarchical, too bureaucratic. And this notion then that Brigham Young was a ruthless tyrant, and that Brigham Young, who formulated the modern LDS Church, invented polygamy, that seems quite intuitive to them. So the Joseph Smith they are able to create is a grassroots mystic, a seer, a visionary, someone who is not affiliated with large-scale, frightening institutions, who seems a lot like, frankly, Denver Snuffer or Phil Davis.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that a little bit. It is really interesting because, like Matt was talking about, it's clear that a lot of these polygamy deniers have a very doctrinal goal, right? They're trying to critique the LDS Church. They're trying to say it's too powerful, it's too hierarchical, and it's smothering real religiosity, right? And so they're using this narrative of Young forcing the narrative of polygamy and of Joseph Smith practicing polygamy as a way to critique the power of the institutional church and say, what else are they controlling? What other narratives are they forcing upon us that aren't real?
It is really telling, I think, that a number of people in the polygamy denial movement also believe the conspiracy theory that Brigham Young had Joseph Smith killed. Right? And that Joseph, there of course was a documentary about this a couple of years ago, which posited that Brigham Young sent John Taylor and Wilfred Woodruff to Carthage jail with Joseph Smith so that they could kill him. Right? So Joseph Smith would then be gone, and Brigham Young could assume dictatorial control over this church. Right? We can see there, I think, the ways in which these various conspiratorial ideas kind of snap together.
I want to ask, and Matt, maybe this is more for you. I'm not sure. Brooke, it might be. Why members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, why some don't accept their faith's own position that Joseph practiced polygamy? Why are they more comfortable ascribing that to Brigham Young, when it seems the tie to Joseph Smith would better support their belief in their church? Why is that?
I've got a couple thoughts, and then Brooke may have some as well. The first is, I think, that over the past generation or two, as the LDS Church has, in the face of the sexual revolution in the 1960s, increasingly emphasized monogamous heterosexual marriage, the nuclear family, the sort of idealized Western vision of the nuclear family as divinely mandated. It is awkward then to imagine Joseph Smith as someone who was not abiding by that way of living, right? And you do see, the scholar Stephen Taysom has done a lot of really interesting work on the transformation of the image of Emma Smith in the 20th century church, and how Emma Smith becomes, in the late 20th century, useful to the LDS Church again as the sort of devoted single wife of Joseph Smith, right? So for a long time, the LDS Church did present Joseph Smith as sort of the model of domestic ideals. And thus, right, members of the church accustomed to thinking of him in that way may find it difficult to assimilate this very kind of different vision of Joseph Smith that historians may reveal.
Brooke, any thoughts?
No, I think that's spot on. I do think in listening to some of the rhetoric of these polygamy deniers, it seems like they are sometimes reacting to the realities of 20th century Mormon polygamists, right? One of the things that they do is they kind of remember Brigham Young as a type of Warren Jeffs. And that's they're imagining that he had the type of authoritarian control that Warren Jeffs had. So I think in the wake of Warren Jeffs and other polygamist movements that were revealed to be really awful, I think it has become even more difficult to imagine Joseph Smith as a polygamist, especially when you think about the fact that he was marrying teenage girls, if you believe these accounts, right? And so I think the atrocities of someone like Warren Jeffs is pushing them even further and making them want to deny that Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
So, Matt, where do others in the Mormon universe stand on this issue? Why does it matter to them?
When you say others in the Mormon universe, who are you thinking of?
I don't know, actually.
well,
anyone,
okay.
Matt, could be anyone in other words, not just Latter-day Saints, could be people followers of some of these, of Snuffer and things like that.
No, we can absolutely run with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we can start maybe with the, today what's called Community of Christ, right? The old RLDS Church. Richard and Pamela Price, who were the couple who began researching polygamy in the 19th century in an attempt to exonerate Joseph Smith and to prove that it was brought to the church by Brigham Young. They were doing so in large part because they were very angry with contemporary RLDS historians, people like Richard Howard and Robert Flanders, who were beginning to argue within the RLDS church that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. So for the Prices, they saw accepting Joseph Smith as a polygamist as part and parcel of a really troubling liberalizing tendency in their church. They believed that Howard and Flanders were elite academics who were trying to corrupt the faith. And they eventually actually left the RLDS church because they perceived it as becoming too liberal. And in many ways, then, they were, I think, emblematic of some of these other schismatic movements like those of Denver Snuffer or Phil Davis, right, who are increasingly, I think, seeing this attempt to protect Joseph Smith from the accusation of polygamy as a way to resist the liberalizing trends of modernity in many ways.
What do all these different players stand to gain by answering the question of Joseph Smith's polygamy?
To say that he was not a polygamist. I think for many of them.
Or that he was,
Sure. Yeah, of course. Well, in some ways, right, I think for the LDS Church, affirming his polygamy and attempting increasingly to present the sources, as they have done through the Joseph Smith Papers Project or through the Gospel Topics essays. What the LDS Church is trying to do there is to present itself as being on the side of the historians, right, as being professional and modern. And facing up to the facts in all of these ways, whereas groups like Denver Snuffers Remnant Group, right? A non-polygamist Joseph Smith is a Joseph Smith who is inspired, who is anti-institutional, who is really a radical in the way that they perceive themselves to be. So you have in this kind of this feud, perhaps, you have a kind of modern professionalized Joseph Smith on the side of the LDS Church and a visionary anti-modern Joseph Smith on the side of these other folks.
Okay, a last question for both of you, and I feel obligated to ask you, in your view, each of you as scholars of Mormon history, did Joseph Smith practice polygamy? And what compels your belief in whatever your answer is? Brooke, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Like I said, like we talked about before, there is really no way, historians all recognize, there's no way to know for sure what happened in the past. We are always willing to amend our historical narratives if you're a good historian. And so I would say that the majority of the evidence, analyzing the evidence objectively, it's very difficult to deny that he did. That there is simply enough evidence that he did, as a historian, I would say yes, he practiced polygamy.
Matt?
Yeah, I think Brooke nailed it there, right? I think one of the things that polygamy deniers will often look for is a single definitive piece of evidence, right? A perfect piece of evidence that will prove everything one way or the other, but that kind of evidence just almost never actually exists. So what we deal with is preponderances. What does most of the evidence seem to say? What does most of the evidence, when weighed in light of its own reliability and its own provenance, seem to say? And for me, as for Brooke, I think the preponderance of the evidence affirms that he was, in fact, a polygamist.
Well, Brooke Lefevre, Matthew Bowman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Solid Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sotrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.